I'm here with Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran. Alexander, let's talk about the Mark Steyn interview of George Papadopoulos. This was actually sent to us by a friend of ours, a mutual friend of ours in Cyprus, Elias. So Elias, thank you for sending us this video. I saw the video. I know you saw it. I actually saw it twice because, first of all, I want to say, great job to Mark Steyn. I thought it was a really good interview. It was very relaxed. The two guys were really just kind of talking very, very openly, very freely. And, what was your impression of Papadopoulos? My impression was he came off very sincere. He seemed very honest, very, very intelligent. I mean, we were talking before the video. I almost feel like, as we get into the story, like I owe him an apology because many times I was like, he must have not been intelligent to have fallen for this spying trap. But I mean, he really told his story and it was very compelling. And I understand now what he went through. I mean, he was targeted hard.
Well, I do owe Papadopoulos an apology. First of all, I completely agree with you. To me, he came across as intelligent, sincere, to the point, very clear, very clear-headed. I had assumed, and this is based on what Robert Mueller said about him in his indictment, that he was some sort of Walter Mitty character who had come along on behalf of the Trump campaign, come to London. It all come to his head, coming to London and mixing with all sorts of important people here, and that he thought that single-handed he could play Henry Kissinger and arrange a summit meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. I now realize that was completely not the case, and I'm very sorry that I thought those things about Papadopoulos, and I would like to say that I wrote an article based on that misconception of him, which you can find on the Duran, and I completely and entirely take it back. Now, having got that out of the way, I want to say that I absolutely agree. Papadopoulos tells an extraordinary story. It's quite clear to me from what he says that there was that there were a lot of very powerful and frankly very sinister people took an extraordinary interest in him right from the very beginning, and far sooner than I had imagined, much earlier than I had imagined. I think that Mark Steyn, the interviewer, who is a fine journalist, British journalist based in Britain, I think he did a superb job getting Papadopoulos to speak in a relaxed and straightforward way about what happened to him. I thought that the story that Papadopoulos gave, which was incredibly detailed, was remarkable. And I think that anybody who wants to understand the origins of Russiagate needs to see that video and needs to listen very carefully to all the things that Papadopoulos says. And I would point out, before we proceed further, that all the people that he mentions, the various people in the US embassy, the various people in the Australian embassy, the various contacts that he was talking about, these are all real people, and it shows that his story is true.
Yeah, and I'll put a link for the Mark Steyn video in the description box as well, so our viewers can really, really strongly recommend you seeing that video, because it is truly an incredible story that Papadopoulos tells. And to me, Alexander, let's get into the story a bit. One thing I realized is that this 28, 29-year-old guy that was, in London, just going from a think tank to an energy consultant, just trying to make his way up in the world, pretty ambitious young gentleman, had, at one point in time, I counted 4 intelligence agencies at the same time spying on him. He had the CIA, and maybe, in conjunction with the FBI, definitely the CIA. He had the MI6, he had Italian intelligence, and he had Australian intelligence.
Yes.
He had some very big players from Alexander Downer all the way to Cameron's office, David Cameron, who was prime minister at the time, keeping tabs on this guy. And all of this you mentioned started not in 2017 or 2006. This started in 2015, specifically
Yes.
November 2015. Take us into a little bit of the timeline, because the timeline is extraordinary as to how this all came about.
I mean, it is remarkable because he was, first of all, in a way that is not entirely, even to me now, still clear. He was basically siphoned off to London. He was then given this job at this very mysterious London Law Academy, which I confess I'd never heard of up to now.
Let me find London Center for International Law Practice.
Which, as I said, I mean, from the sound of it, sounds to be both very high-powered and very, very well-resourced, and as he himself said, was actually doing nothing. I mean, it wasn't involved in any law practice, I mean, despite its title. And I think he himself had problems understanding what it was. He was being introduced to all these extraordinary people. This is in 2015, mind you. He'd already expressed previously an interest in Donald Trump and in joining his campaign, because he thought that Donald Trump was talking about things that the American people were interested in. And by the way, that's one point that he and I were both making at roughly the same time. And there's even an article in the Duran in which I made precisely that point from early 2016, in which I was saying that, Donald Trump, one of the reasons he was gaining traction was because he was actually addressing real concerns that people in the US actually have. And Papadopoulos, to his immense credit, understood that very quickly. And he was talking right from the beginning about, his interest in joining Donald Trump's campaign, meeting with incredulity at the Hudson Institute. He then joined, instead of joining Donald Trump's campaign, which was at that time full and didn't have a place for him, he joined Ben Carson's campaign. You remember? I don't know whether people remember Ben Carson. Very brief thing. But he then got somehow diverted to London, away from Washington, D.C., where he'd been based and where he knew the territory. And almost from the moment he arrived there, he starts getting these approaches from people in the U.S. Embassy, from this most mysterious, as I said, a law academy or of practice or whatever it was, a law practice. All sorts of prominent people on the British scene. And I have to say, this extraordinary interest in him did make me wonder, and this is a point which I mentioned in a message I sent to you, but he didn't, I think, pick up on this, whether there wasn't an attempt by some of these organizations in London to try and recruit him in order to get him to spy on the Donald Trump campaign. Whether that wasn't perhaps the agenda. But anyway, if that was the plan, he clearly didn't fall for it. What happened instead was that he got this bizarre invitation to Rome, ended up at what was, by all accounts, in fact, what has been verified as being a spy school, a CIA, FBI school in Rome. I think this is in early 2016, where he is introduced to Joseph Mifsud. And Joseph Mifsud says to him that he is able to get him in contact with all these important Russians. Now, up to this point, Papadopoulos had no contact with anybody in Russia. He'd done work as a consultant in Israel and Cyprus, and knew quite a lot of people in Cyprus and Israel, but he knew
no president of Cyprus.
Apparently, he knew Anastasiades, the president of Cyprus. They were on first name terms. But by the way, I don't find that completely surprising, because he's obviously a Greek American, and he was at the Hudson Institute. And as you said, he's very bright, and he's discussing a field where Cyprus has a lot of interests. So I don't find that entirely surprising in itself, especially in a place like Cyprus. The fact that he was getting contacts with all these important people in Britain, where hardly anybody knew him or would have known him before, that is extraordinary. And he gradually began to get himself suspicious about it. But then, as I said, he's siphoned off to Rome, and there he meets Joseph Mifsud. And Joseph Mifsud presents himself as this person with all these contacts in Russia. But in fact, as Mark Steyn himself pointed out, Mifsud is somebody who doesn't seem to have had many contacts in Russia, but who does seem to have had all sorts of contacts in Britain amongst top-ranking members of the British elite, including people like Boris Johnson, and of course in the United States. I mean, he had some kind of connection with the Hillary Clinton Foundation, and of course the place where Papadopoulos met him was at this spy school, the CIA, FBI spy school, which is acknowledged spy school in Rome. So all of this points very clearly to Mifsud, it seems to me, having all his connections with British and US intelligence, not with Russian intelligence at all.
Yeah, I mean, going back to when he was in London before he was sent to Rome, Papadopoulos chronicles the fact that when he told this London Center for International Law Practice, where he was, working at, which he also said they appointed him a director almost immediately, and there he got suspicious, saying, why are these guys giving me such a prominent position so quickly?
Yes.
And
Yes.
at first, his mind went to the fact that maybe, because of his work in the energy sector and knowing the people he did in Cyprus and in Israel, he thought that maybe the MI6 was at first interested in finding out what his position was, according to one, the energy finds in Cyprus at the time, but also with the fact that the UK has, bases in Cyprus as well, military bases. They wanted to kind of get a feel for him. That's where his mind went at first. But obviously it seemed that everything progressed and it turned towards a Russia angle the minute he said he wants to go work for the Trump campaign. But he mentions a name. He says, when I said I was going to go work for the Trump campaign, I was immediately introduced to Arvinder Sambe.
Yes.
And he says this lady, Arvinder Sambe, from the London Center for International Law Practice, has connections to the MI6, FBI, and Australian intelligence. Yes. And she previously worked with Robert Mueller after 9/11 and with Bruce Orr. What do you make of I mean, a lot of dots all of a sudden, in my mind, said, oh my God, a lot of dots are connected here.
Well, indeed they are, and I mean the point to make about this person is, of course, that she's a lawyer, and there was some suggestions that she's a Queen's Counsel. I'm not sure about that. I'd have to check it, but I mean, obviously, somebody who clearly has very prominent connections with both the British and US establishments. I mean, the intelligence establishments in both of these countries, and I mean, who's worked, as you correctly said, with Robert Mueller when Robert Mueller was head of the FBI. So we're talking about a very, very high-powered person indeed, a British lawyer, somebody with intelligence connections, and lo and behold, almost immediately, when Papadopoulos says he's going to work with Donald Trump, he finds himself in contact with her, and that's already very strange.
And now at the spy school, you said, he also said that this spy school also hosted Christopher Steele as well.
Absolutely.
Right. There's another name that once again pops up in the entire Russiagate thing. But going back to Mifsud, so the trap is kind of set for Mifsud.
Can I just interrupt you and remind you also that one of the key meetings that Christopher Steele has with the FBI is in Rome. He actually also meets them in Rome, which is, I think, sometime in the autumn of 2016. That's a year later.
Coordinates with his timeline and makes sense.
Exactly.
Because he was looking at 2016 when he was in Rome.
Yes, exactly. So, I mean, all sorts of things are going on in Rome. And Rome obviously is a place where an awful lot of contacts are being established and an awful lot of people are speaking to each other. So Christopher Steele has been at this school. Christopher Steele is meeting with the FBI in Rome.
Maybe he knows Mifsud?
Maybe he knows Mifsud, very likely. And at the same time, as we learned from Papadopoulos, Papadopoulos himself is being sent to Rome and ending up in the same spy school as the one where Christopher Steele went.
Now, Mifsud, Papadopoulos says that Mifsud was pretty much coordinating what he called a dangle operation, which is, the intelligence speak for what they were setting up, this trap that they were setting up for Papadopoulos. And so Mifsud at first started to probe Papadopoulos as to his sympathies towards Russia.
Yes.
So he asked him about his Orthodox religion, being Greek. Yeah. He asked him what he thought of the war that was waged against Serbia and the NATO bombings of Serbia. So he was trying to get a feel for Papadopoulos. Yes. Mifsud. So Mifsud was kind of profiling him, correct?
Yes. That's exactly what it looks like. I mean, that is. By the way, I've encountered, as a Greek Orthodox person who opposed the war in Yugoslavia, I've had exactly the same kind of questions directed at me by all sorts of interesting people. And it seems that Papadopoulos was being profiled in exactly that way. Clearly, Mifsud was probing to find out where Papadopoulos' sympathies lay. In reality, of course, Papadopoulos is a conservative, patriotic, right-wing American. I mean, he had no sympathies or great interest in Russia whatsoever. And as he pointed out, he had no contacts with Russia up to that point.
And then you get to what I thought was a stunner of an admission by a revelation by Papadopoulos. That's that Mifsud says, hey, you know what, George, I'm going to introduce you to Putin's niece.
Yes. Now, this is where I particularly owe Papadopoulos an apology, because I thought that he'd made up that story about being introduced to Putin's niece. Having listened to his account of it, I totally take that back. It's quite clear that he was being baited by Mifsud. Apparently, whoever this girl was that he was introduced to, this young woman she's very attractive, and it gives all the impressions of having been some kind of a bait. In fact, Papadopoulos was very suspicious about it, and he went back to his employer, this mysterious academy that he was a member of, and he said, does this man Mifsud, does it really all add up? Does he really have the contacts that he claims he does? Is he really who he says he is? And he was told that Mifsud is indeed all those things. So far from being a Walter Mitty personality, I get the strong impression that this is where, at this point, this is where Papadopoulos' doubts are steadily beginning to grow.
Yeah, so let's triangulate this a little. So you have at this London Center for International Law Politics, you have what seems to be the CIA and the MI6, behind it.
Yes.
They whisk Papadopoulos to Italy, where you then have the Italian intelligence agencies come on board.
Yes.
They're corroborating each other's story. Whatever Mifsud is saying, London is saying, yes, this guy's on the up and up. Believe him.
Yes.
This guy will introduce you to Putin's niece, even though we need to tell viewers she wasn't Putin's niece. I mean, it was all fabrication.
Putin doesn't have a niece. I mean, this individual, whoever she was absolutely not Putin's niece. Let's be absolutely clear about that. There is no such person in existence.
Yeah. So now it seems to me that they're starting to create this Papadopoulos Russia connection.
Indeed, they are.
Right.
Indeed, they are. And of course, it turns out that Mifsud doesn't actually have any real contacts with Russia. As Papadopoulos himself says, the only connection that Mifsud is able to provide Papadopoulos is with one individual who is a middle-ranking official at the Valdai Club, which is a Russian think tank. I should say that when I read Mueller's indictment, that was something that stood out to me immediately, because Mueller spins these contacts between Papadopoulos and this individual at the Valdai Club to make it sound as if Papadopoulos was in contact with high-level people in the Russian government. That was not the case. Mifsud's introduction was to a person of no importance whatsoever. As Papadopoulos says to Steyn, it's somebody he could have contacted all by himself without any difficulty, simply by going to the contact bar, the contact link at the Valdai Center. It was no more than that.
All right, and there you get me to my next question. This is where Mifsud springs what I consider the trap.
Yeah.
The first part of the trap on Papadopoulos, which is Mifsud says to Papadopoulos that he knows, because of Mifsud's Russia connections, his fabricated Russia connections, but Mifsud knows that the Russians hacked into the Hillary Clinton emails, and they have those emails.
Correct.
And that's the information that he passes on to Papadopoulos. Correct. So the first half of the operation has been kind of completed. The trap has been set.
Yeah, this happens in a plush 5-star hotel near Liverpool Street Station in London. I know the hotel, and I think I have a pretty shrewd idea where this happened, but within the hotel. And as Papadopoulos correctly says, it's a public place with lots and lots of people present. I'm guessing that there were people listening to that conversation and taking notes and possibly recording it. Anyway, out of nowhere, out of the blue, Mifsud, in this very public place, says to Papadopoulos, I've been to Russia. All these people in Russia are telling me about how the Russians have got Hillary Clinton's emails. It's very important to stress, and Papadopoulos makes this very clear, we are talking about Hillary Clinton's own personal emails, the emails that passed through her private server when she was Secretary of State, which she deleted and didn't pass on to the FBI. We are not talking about the DNC emails. We are not talking about the Podesta emails. At that point in time, which is early 2016, March 2016, the question of the hacking of the DNC computer had not arisen. Nobody was talking about that. The story of Hillary Clinton having these emails was all over the media. And here we see Joseph Mifsud and whoever he was working with telling Papadopoulos that the Russians have those emails. And Papadopoulos, by his own account, his jaw drops, but he doesn't respond to this. He is already, at this point, extremely suspicious of what Mifsud is all about. Now, can I say something else? And it's very important to make this point. When Mueller indicted Papadopoulos on the charge of lying to the FBI, Mueller gives a completely misleading account of this meeting between Mifsud and Papadopoulos, because the wording of the relevant paragraph in that indictment is such as to create the entirely false impression that the emails that are being discussed are the DNC and Podesta emails. Now, when I read that indictment, after a lot of thinking, I figured out that it was, in fact, Hillary Clinton's own personal emails. It refers to emails of Clinton. But Mueller, quite intentionally, makes that an unclear. Now, that is a complete misuse of the indictment process, and it should make us extremely suspicious of anything else that Mueller says in any of his other indictments.
Right. Very good point. Very good point. So you have the first part of the trap is set, and now we get to the second part. And this one is even more creative than the first part, because according to Papadopoulos, he had given an interview, I believe it was to the Times of London. I remember the interview where he criticized David Cameron as to what you were saying previously as we started this segment about Trump's policies towards immigration and so on and so forth, where Cameron came out and publicly but at that time it was candidate Trump, where Cameron, came out against candidate Trump for candidate Trump's rhetoric as to some of his thoughts on immigration and stuff like that. And Papadopoulos gave an interview to the London paper, and he's basically told Cameron to, back off.
Yes. So this is right. Okay. So what we discussed, which happened with Mifsud in the hotel near Liverpool Street Station, that is the dangle, to use the technical spy craft word that Papadopoulos has now learned. That is the bait, if you like. Now after the bait has been sprung, we now have the setup. And the setup is this interview, which Papadopoulos is drawn into giving to the London Times. Now, again, it's very important to pay attention to what Papadopoulos says to Mark Steyn, because this is a point where, again, I got the whole Papadopoulos story wrong, because I thought that Papadopoulos had given an incredibly brash and crude interview to the London Times in which he severely criticised and condemned David Cameron for criticising Donald Trump. In fact, what happened, according to Papadopoulos, and I'm sure he's telling the truth, is that the journalists from the Times, by the way, has a long history in Britain, going back to the First World War and beyond, of having connections to the intelligence services. I just mentioned that. Anyway, the journalist from the Times asked him a question about, what did he think of these comments that Cameron had made about Trump. And according to Papadopoulos, in a very measured way, Papadopoulos said, I thought that those comments were inappropriate and that Cameron shouldn't have made them about somebody who might one day, very soon, be president of the United States. And the reporter took those comments of Papadopoulos, and the Times spun the interview and made it a headline story and made it seem like Papadopoulos had gone out of his way in the most brash and vulgar fashion to criticize the Prime Minister of Great Britain. So, in other words, he said something that was, he misreported the interview that Papadopoulos had given, and that nearly lost Papadopoulos his job with the Trump campaign. Jeff Sessions was very angry. Jeff Sessions was at that point running the foreign policy team for Donald Trump, and apparently it was Trump himself that decided that, Papadopoulos should be kept on as a member of the Trump team. So it was an attempt, I think, to put Papadopoulos on the back foot and to soften him up for the next stage of the entrapment.
The Australian intelligence that comes into play, and they bring Mr. Alexander Downer, and you can get into his position in a little more detail. I'm sure you know it well. He was Australia's former foreign minister, but he was also the Australian High Commissioner in London, an interesting title. And he's the guy that, springs the trap on Papadopoulos, or Papadopoulos falls into the trap almost, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
And Alexander Downer's the guy that, according to Papadopoulos, records it and passes it on.
Well, this is where I think it becomes really extraordinary, because, of course, this is where many of the reports that have appeared in, say, the New York Times, and which the FBI has been pushing, are now directly contradicted by Papadopoulos' story. Because you're quite correct to say, firstly, Papadopoulos gives this interview to the Times, which is misreported in a way that puts him on the back foot. And then he is invited out of the blue, so far as one can see, to meet the Australian High Commissioner. Now, the Australian High Commissioner is the equivalent of the ambassador, Australia's ambassador to the United Kingdom. Australia is a Commonwealth country. As a member of the British Commonwealth, the title of the official who represents Australia in Britain is High Commissioner. Now, as Mark Steyn in the video is careful to explain, relations between Britain and Australia are extremely close. The intelligence services of the two countries work very closely. They're both part of the Five Eyes alliance. And in practice, the job of being High Commissioner, Australian High Commissioner in London, is almost something of a sinecure. It's a very, very cushy position. Now, Downer was the former foreign minister. He was obviously a well-connected and important man in Australia. He comes from a diplomatic family. His father was apparently also High Commissioner, Australian High Commissioner in Britain. He's obviously a very well-connected, very establishment person, a member of the Australian establishment, a member of the British establishment, because the two are essentially linked or are linked very closely. He is a heavyweight in these kind of circles. And out of the blue, he invites Papadopoulos to this meeting in this bar, this wine bar, which, by the way, I've also visited.
Kensington?
Exactly. The Kensington wine place, whatever. I don't remember exactly, but it's quite exactly. It's a very plush, elegant sort of place. Papadopoulos goes there expecting it to be a pleasant social occasion. He finds the Australian High Commissioner there, accompanied by a middle-ranking official who is probably there to keep a record of what's going on. And of course, the interview takes a very dramatic and unexpected turn, because the High Commissioner becomes extremely aggressive, tells Papadopoulos, bringing up again the interview that Papadopoulos gave to the Times. He tells Papadopoulos not to back off criticisms of David Cameron, which is a most remarkable thing to do. I mean, comes down really, really heavy on Papadopoulos and holds out like this his mobile phone in a way that makes it quite clear that he's recording what Papadopoulos is saying. And after, as I said, threatening Papadopoulos in this way, tries to draw out Papadopoulos on the kind of things that Mifsud had been telling him. And the fascinating thing, and this is where the contradiction between Papadopoulos' account comes and what the FBI has been saying, both to Congress and to the media, especially specifically to the New York Times, is that it seems from Papadopoulos' account that he actually said nothing about what Mifsud had told him about all of these emails of Clinton's that the Russians supposedly had. Yet, the story that we are being told is that Downer got very heard in this sort of drunken meeting with a drunken and intoxicated Papadopoulos bragging about the information he'd been given by Mifsud, and Downer thinking about it, doing a report to Australian intelligence, becoming really concerned about it when, after the hacking happened, and then, or rather after the WikiLeaks published the DNC emails, and then reporting it to the FBI, who then supposedly, because they're also worried about the Downer's report, they then start the Russiagate investigation. Well, that's not what Papadopoulos says happened. Papadopoulos says that he didn't say anything about Mifsud, which of course begs the question, if he didn't say anything about Mifsud, how did Downer know that Mifsud said that to Papadopoulos?
That's the million-dollar question. It's very clear that if we are to believe Papadopoulos' story, and he does come off as very sincere and very fact-oriented, very detailed.
Yes.
Downer's recorded nothing.
Exactly. There was nothing to record. And of course, it's quite clear this whole thing, that this was an entrapment, a trap, which to Papadopoulos' huge credit, he didn't fall into. As I said, he was softened up with the episode with the Times, but instead of allowing himself to be bullied by Downer into admissions, he pushed back, and that speaks of a young man with a lot of character.
Yeah, and I think Mark Steyn summed it up best, and I'll try to crystallize it as well, and then you can comment. So Mark Steyn at the end of the video said, basically what you have here is Mifsud telling Papadopoulos that Russia has Hillary emails. Papadopoulos was then supposed to meet with Downer and tell Downer what Mifsud told him, in which case Downer would then say, gotcha, it's on my phone, let me pass it on to the CIA and the FBI. And on the U.S. side of things, it shows that they have credible evidence from one of the Five Eyes, and they have corroboration that Papadopoulos, who's in the Trump campaign, has information about Russia.
Correct.
Was working with Russia.
That's exactly what it was. I mean, it was a very, very careful setup. There was the dangle, and then there was the softening up, and then there was the trap. And Papadopoulos didn't fall into the trap. And that is very, very interesting and very remarkable. But someone in the FBI nonetheless seems to have decided to go along with the story and pretend that he did. And I can't help but think that the reason they did that is because the only other evidence that they had to justify starting the Russiagate collusion investigation was the Steele dossier, and they knew that they couldn't rely on it.
What an incredible story. I mean, we were talking for about 35 minutes now, but I mean, there's a lot to flush out there, Alexander, but it was really an incredible interview. And, to all our viewers, definitely it's worth, I think it's about a 50-minute long interview. It's definitely worth checking out Mark Steyn interview with Papadopoulos.
I found it absolutely compelling watching. I would say Papadopoulos is good. He's sincere. He's to the point. He's got all the facts at his fingertips. He gives a very clear account of what happened. And Steyn is excellent. He asks all the right questions. He's clearly familiar with the background material, and he's also able to add his own things because he knows, for example, he's actually met Downer. I mean, he has photos of him, so he's able to give descriptions of the kind of individual that Downer is. So, I mean, that's just one example. He also knows some of the people that Mifsud was associated with. So the two of them are able to join lots and lots of the dots. I cannot.
Were dots joined for you? I mean, when you did light bulbs go off, and you said,
absolutely.
okay, this is clear now.
They did. I mean, there's a number of vitally important things. I mean, firstly, we are now far further towards understanding how Mifsud we now know how Mifsud and Papadopoulos got together, and we know an awful lot more now about the kind of individual that Mifsud was. I mean, the very fact that Mifsud met Papadopoulos at the spy school in Rome really gives the whole story away. I mean, we now know that Mifsud's connections are not with Russia at all, despite Mueller's pretense that they were. They are with Western intelligence. And we can see the trap being executed in this bizarre setup at the hotel, the five-star hotel in London, where, as I said, Mifsud springs this trap. We see the vital role of the London Times interview, which I had not realised up to that moment. And of course, we see the final attempt. The way Downer was then brought in. Australia, exactly, was brought in to try to close the ring. So it's all very fascinating. I mean, I think you described it very well when you said that it was James Bond stuff. I mean, right down to the.
It really is.
No, it really is with the attractive girls thrown in. You know, the pretty girls, the pretty Russian who is, it turns, you know, who's sold as Putin's niece and bizarre things of that kind, all intended to turn Papadopoulos' head, but interestingly, it doesn't. And of course, I would also add, to those who take an interest in these things, the other spy novelist that came to mind, or rather spy writer, is John le Carré, who projects this very seedy, labyrinthine, complicated plotting that the British like to carry out. And of course, le Carré, actually, like Ian Fleming, the creator of James Bond, they both worked in the intelligence services in Britain, so they both have a feel for the kind of way these sort of things are done. Certainly le Carré does. And we see this very complicated plot that they attempted to pull. And the interesting thing is it didn't really come off.
Incredible. Kensington Wine Bar, or whatever that wine room, I think it's called. That's where it all started.
That's right. It is. It's the Kensington Wine Rooms. And can I just say something? Of course, if Papadopoulos had fallen for the trap, we would have had recordings of his admissions, and they would have been all over the place. But of course, he never did.
Incredible story. All right, Alexander, thank you for breaking it down for us. Guys, if you like this video, click on the subscribe button down below. And go to the Duran shop. Alexander, you are wearing a Duran polo, I believe, correct?
And I'm absolutely, and can I just say, incredibly comfortable, beautifully made, beautifully embroidered. I used to have my suits made in Savile Row. I used to have my shirts made in Jermyn Street. I can tell good quality. This is very good quality. And I would also refer to this very handsome mug. And
the mug's good. It feels good. It's
I would recommend both to all our viewers.
Put it up to the camera again to show our viewers.
There we go. It's good, solid stuff.
All right, it's big.
Good, solid stuff. It's good. Great for drinking big mugs of tea, as I often do.
All right, great. So go to the Duran shop, guys. Pick up some merchandise. It really helps us out. Also, donate to us on PayPal and on Patreon. The links are in the description box down below. And you can get an audio copy of this video. Follow us on iTunes and on SoundCloud as well. And you can follow us on Instagram, @theduran_com. And of course, download the Blank Chat app and follow us there as well, the Duran channel. And go to theduran.com, our new website, and see the articles that Alexander is linking up to every day. Alexander Mercouris, Editor-in-Chief of the Duran. Thank you once again. Until next time, everybody, take care.